What if I told you that by simply attaching a focal reducer to a telescope, like attaching the 0.7 times reducer on the Celestron Edge HD 11 telescope, I would magically make this telescope collect more light? Are you screaming at your screen yet?
Okay, so let me qualify that statement a little bit, or that question a little bit, by adding one specific keyword to it. And with that, I can say that if you take a telescope like the Celestron Edge HD 11, and you add the 0.7 times focal reducer at the back end of that telescope, the telescope, despite having the same aperture, will magically gather more usable light than without the reducer. And that statement with the word usable actually is true. And if you're still screaming at the screen, keep watching, because I explain exactly why and how this works. And of course, this folds in entirely into the focal ratio debate. Is it useless? Is it useful, meaningless, meaningful, etc., etc.? And basically, I thought, with that question in mind, like, why does adding a focal reducer actually increase the amount of usable light that the telescope gathers? It made me think that there's a very interesting way of thinking of telescopes, of imagining telescopes, not as like, gather light rays and focus them and blah, blah, blah. No, they're simply a tool that will take a field of view circle and map it to an image circle that you can place a sensor in. That's all that a telescope does, and when you go back to the basics like that, you can really understand what is happening with the photons that are collected by your telescope. Okay, step back and let's understand a bit the details. First, we're looking at the night skies. I have my telescope there and I'm pointing it at the light sky. And the telescope, basically, as I was saying, its job is to take a field of view and map it to an image circle that the camera will be able to sample from. So that field of view, we can represent it as a circle in the sky, and that circle has a certain radius. That radius, it's not measured in millimeters or meters, but we basically take the angle from the center of that circle to the edge of the circle. So we're doing something like that, center, edge of the circle, looking at the angle between my hands. If it's 1 degree, it means that the field of view of that is covered by the telescope is 2 degrees, right? Because 1 degree would be the radius, or the arc radius of our field of view. So let's say that this telescope here is able to take that field of view, that 2 degrees diameter or arc diameter field of view, and what it does is it will go ahead and map it to an image circle. And that's literally all that the telescope does. Okay, so we understand what the telescope does. It's just a mapping tool. And if we zoom into that image circle, just look at the image circle that has been produced by the telescope. I can place my camera so that the sensor is within that image circle, and what's within this rectangle there is what gets actually imaged by the sensor at the end of the telescope. So in our case, this little camera there would be sampling from the image circle via its sensor placed within the image circle. And now that we understand that the telescope is just a mapping device between the field of view and the image circle, we can look at the impact of different parameters like aperture or focal length. And we can keep the field of view kind of the same, but like, what field of view can a telescope, like, what is the amplitude or the size of the field of view that a telescope can map to an image circle, and how large that image circle is going to be, is actually one of the prime characteristics of a telescope. And once you have that characteristic, you don't need to care about focal length anymore. You only need to care about aperture in a moment. First, we need to understand, let's go back to our image circle in the sky. Okay, we have our image circle in the sky, and that image circle is basically, like, this whole area of the sky is pretty much emitting the same amount of photons all the time, right? There's a specific amount of photons on average that this circle in the sky emits towards us every hour, let's say, right? And our telescope, via its lens at the front, basically collects a portion of those photons that are emitted. But it's very important to understand that this is a a fixed total amount of photons that are available, and the telescope, via its aperture, will collect a fixed amount of photons per hour based on its aperture. Now, when I say fixed, it's actually not fixed, it's an average. There's the Poisson distribution, there's like a standard deviation, there's all sorts of stuff, but let's simplify stuff, it's more or less fixed. So now that we understand that, the telescope is looking at something that emits a fixed number of photons, and the telescope samples those photons based on its aperture, what happens to the image circle that the telescope maps our field of view to if we increase the aperture? Well, the image circle it will just brighten. Because if we have a larger aperture, for example, instead of that small thing, we take that much larger SV Boni, like what is it, the SV 503-102, much larger aperture, that telescope here, it will gather much more photons from that same field of view, assuming that it actually is able to capture the exact same field of view as the smaller one. And so our image is much brighter, because out of this limited shower of photons that we get from our field of view, we're able to capture more at one time via the aperture. If we go back to this small aperture or even smaller aperture, the image, the overall image, that image circle, will be darker. And this is where people who say that only the aperture matters come from, right? The telescope is just mapping a field of view to an image circle. If I increase the aperture, my image circle is brighter. If I decrease the aperture, my image circle is darker. And what about the impact of the focal length? Let's assume that we have our telescope and we're able, without affecting the field of view that we are gathering, we're able to still map the entire same 2 degrees field of view to an image circle, but we increase the focal length of the telescope, meaning we zoom in more. Well, in that case, the image circle, while we're zooming in more, in order to capture still the same amount of field of view, those 2 degrees of field of view, the image circle has to become bigger. And because the image circle is bigger by increasing the focal length, that fixed amount of photons that we are getting from our field of view via our aperture, it has to be spread thin, like butter over too much bread. And if I were to place a sensor on top of that, and you look at the grid and each of the pixels, smaller area of our field of view, meaning we get more details, but at the same time, each of those pixels, because we are spreading the light over more bread, is getting fewer photons. Now, in real life, unfortunately, if we increase the focal length of a telescope, unless we're able to achieve some optical miracles, typically we also reduce the amount of the field of view that the telescope is able to map to an imaging circle. So we make the imaging circle smaller at the same time, which is not good because we're actually cutting off a bit of the field of view that we're trying to capture. And that means that that shower of photons, that light that we are gathering, it's less light because we've cut off part of the field of view. In total, we are gathering less light. And what happens if we do the opposite? We take the telescope, we assume that we can change the focal length without changing the field of view that it is capable of mapping to an image circle. But if we lower that focal length, we zoom in less. Therefore, our image circle necessarily becomes smaller. And so all of that light that is fixed, right? We are capturing a fixed amount of light from the target field of view, those 2 degrees of field of view, and from our aperture. If I place a camera sensor on top of our smaller image circle, we're now able to have much more light per pixel of our camera sensor. But at the same time, each pixel of the camera now covers a larger area of our field of view than before, so we get fewer details. So it's always the trade-off between more details, less light, or fewer details, more light per pixel. And now we are ready to address the initial statement or question at the very start of this video. And for that, first, let's look at the specifications of the Celestron Edge HD 11. Okay, so I'm on the page of the Edge HD 11-inch optical tube assembly telescope. So that's the example that I was giving. And if we look at the specs, the stuff that is important that we have been looking at is the focal length, the aperture, so we get a whole 11-inch of apertures, like the dream, and the image circle, which, weirdly enough, is not written in the specs itself. But fear not, if we go to another page from the Celestron website, we can see that the diameter of the image circle for the Edge HD 11 is 42 millimeters, and it stays 42 millimeters after we add the reducer, and that's going to be an important little thing. So now that we know that, we can actually figure out exactly what field of view we are mapping to our 42 millimeter image circle. We know our image circle is going to be 42 millimeters. We know that our focal length is 2800 millimeters, so now we can actually figure out the radius and the diameter of the arc radius, arc diameter of that circle in the sky that the telescope's job is to map to that 42 millimeter image circle. So how do we do that? Simple way is to go to astronomy.tools. We can select a target like the Lagoon Nebula, and I can select, it's actually available in the list, the Celestron C11 Edge HD. And you can see it has automatically input the focal length, which is what is interesting to us to determine the field of view that our Edge HD 11 is mapping. The next step is to consider that we know the image circle diameter is 42 millimeters. So the way to represent that is to say pixel size 42 times 42 micrometers, and then you put a resolution on a custom camera of 1000 pixels per 1000 pixels. Just click on Add to View, and you can see this is a first square, and the inscribed circle to the square is what we'll be looking at as the field of view that the Edge HD 11 maps to the 42 millimeter image circle. And I can add the reducer, because we know the reducer is 0.7 times reducer, add to view, and now we have a second square, and the inscribed circle to that square is the field of view that the reduced Edge HD 11 maps to its 42 millimeter image circle. So let's put those two together. First, the Edge HD without reducer field of view that it maps to its image circle, and then the Edge HD 11 with reducer field of view that it maps to its image circle. What can we notice? The field of view that the telescope is able to gather light from with the 0.7 time reducer is larger than the field of view that it's able to gather from without the reducer. And if we go back to the astronomy.tools website that we were looking at earlier on, we can see that the image circle, or the field of view that the Edge HD telescope is able to gather light from and map to its image circle at full focal length, so without the reducer, the diameter of that field of view circle is 0.86 arc degrees. But if you add the reducer, suddenly the telescope gathers light from a field of view that has a diameter of 1.23 arc degrees. And actually, if you use, and you approximate a little bit, but if you use those field of view diameters or radiuses to compute the surface areas of the field of view circle without the reducer and with the reducer, you'll see that with the reducer, the telescope is able to map a surface area of the field of view that is twice as large as the surface area of the field of view without the reducer. And because the aperture is the same, it's exactly the same telescope, we're just capturing more field of view. And because more field of view means more photons that are falling onto us, or more usable photons that are falling onto us, it means that the telescope is indeed, just by adding the reducer, gathering more useful light simply because it has a larger imaging circle that covers a larger field of view. It's able to map a larger field of view to the imaging circle of the same size. But then, of course, you're reducing the focal length. So as you remember, each pixel of your camera, if it's the same camera sensor with and without the reducer, will cover more surface area of your field of view, and therefore you'll capture fewer details. By the way, what do you think happens when we have Hyperstar? What happens with Hyperstar? If you're familiar with it, Hyperstar is when you take the Edge HD11 or another Celestron telescope, you remove the secondary mirror and you replace it with a lens, and then you put a camera on top of that lens. It's a very interesting setup. It's a lot of fun, and Hyperstar always, claims that it makes your telescope so much faster, despite the telescope still having the same 11-inch of aperture. So what exactly does it mean? Let's go back to the image circle and see exactly what's going to happen. Okay, and so now I'm on the website for Hyperstar, that lens that you put at the front of your Edge HD11, the telescope we've been looking at, and we can see that we have specs for the latest version of their Hyperstar, and they claim that the image circle that the Hyperstar Edge HD11 maps to has a diameter of 35 millimeters, and the equivalent field of view, so what it maps to that image circle, is 3.7 degrees. Let's double check that it's correct. So I'm going to go to mzn.to, and we still have the Edge HD selected. Barlow is none. What I'll do is there's this Celestron C11 Edge HD plus Hyperstar V4, which puts our focal length to 540 millimeters, and Hyperstar, or Starizona, the makers of Hyperstar, are saying that your image circle is 35 millimeters. So I can put 35 millimeter in here. And indeed, it tells me that our field of view is 3.71 degrees, exactly as expected. So let's add to view. And now we have something a bit insane in terms of difference. We are indeed capturing a lot more field of view. And what does it look like when we actually look at the circles themselves? It looks like this. Yes, with the Hyperstar, the field of view is massive. And we can compute actually the surface area of the field of view that the Hyperstar allows those 11-inch of aperture to gather magically compared to the full focal length. So we know that the radius of the field of view that the Hyperstar Edge HD11 is able to map to its image circle is 1.855 arc degrees. So surface area will be that times squared times pi. And this is the result that we get. We get a surface area, roughly, we're being very rough here, of 10.81 square degrees. It's effectively kind of weird way of looking at it, but it's how we're looking at it. And if we do the same thing with the field of view that is covered or available to us by the Edge HD 11 without the reducer, so full focal length, we see a surface area of that field of view of just 0.58 square degrees, or square arc degrees specifically. So if we take our surface area with Hyperstar of 10.81 arc degrees square and divided by 0.58 arc degrees square, what is the ratio between the two? It is 18.6, which means that by installing Hyperstar, and therefore by increasing the field of view that the telescope is able to map to an image circle, we are gathering 18.6 times more usable light with Hyperstar than we did with the telescope at full focal length. It's basically just light that the tube is already gathering. It's gathering it all the time, even when we don't have a Hyperstar, we don't have the reducer on, but that light is made available to us thanks to the Hyperstar in the form of a larger field of view. But wait a second, if I look at the Hyperstar page, it tells me that it converts from f10 to f1.9. Notice that this is basically the first time that we look at actual focal ratios in this video, and it makes the system 25 times faster. That means 25 times shorter exposures. That is actually also true, and it's different than that 18.6. That 18.6 figure, it really means nothing to us. Sorry, this is a whole video about that, so it's kind of fun, but it means nothing to us if we're not using that entire field of view. If we are going to use that with a tiny sensor, we're basically discarding so much of that light, right? So when we look at the surface area of the field of view that we are able to map to an image circle, then it's up to us, the user, to actually make good use of that surface area and try, if we can, to cover as much as possible, to gather as much light as possible in the shape of more field of view. But if we look at the light that is gathered not at the image circle level, not even at the camera sensor level, but at the pixel level, then we can look at focal ratios, or we can look at focal length and kind of understand exactly what happens when we keep the same aperture. I'll just do it quickly. You saw that we looked at, surface areas in degrees of field of view. What about if we look at the surface area of the field of view that is covered by a single pixel on my camera before and after Hyperstar, for instance? Let's see. And with that, we should be able to get back to that ratio of 25 that is advertised by Starizona, the makers of Hyperstar. So we can go back to our field of view calculator, and I'm going to take a random pixel of, let's say, 6 microns, whatever, doesn't really matter. And we'll see that with the Edge HD, without any reducer, we get 0.44 arc seconds per on each side of the pixel. So the surface area of the pixel is 0.44 square in arc second square. And then if we look at the Edge HD plus the Hyperstar, we see 2.29 arc seconds. And so we can take the square of this figure divided by the square of the other figure, and we actually get a ratio of 27. And we can see that effectively a pixel on your camera placed within the image circle of your Edge HD 11 within a given amount of time, that pixel will see roughly 27 times more photons than without Hyperstar, which can be useful if you are having trouble, for instance, really overwhelming the read noise of your camera sensor, which can be a problem if you're imaging in narrowband or if you're imaging from a very dark area, or both. That's even worse. So it really helps you get shorter exposures. But of course, you're sacrificing the amount of details that you can capture by using Hyperstar. Although at the same time, you're getting access to so much more field of view and therefore increasing the amount of usable light that your telescope is gathering by a ratio of 18, as we saw earlier. And by the way, 27 is more than what Hyperstar claims, or Starizona claims on their website. And I think it's because they forgot to update when they moved from f2 with Hyperstar from 560 millimeters focal length to 540 millimeters focal length. If they had redone the calculation, they would see that the ratio is actually 27 and not 25. So even better than claimed. That said, as we saw, in terms of the actual amount of light that is unlocked by using Hyperstar, it's a ratio of 18, although it's not super useful again because we're never able to use the entirety of that image circle. And of course, if you took two camera sensors such that the field of view that's covered by a tiny sensor with the Hyperstar HD 11, if it's exactly the same field of view as what is covered by a much larger sensor with the full focal length of the HD 11, both sensors, because it's still the same aperture of the telescope, they will see the same amount of photons and they will have the same field of view. And that's why a lot of people say like Hyperstar is not real, right? It doesn't really give you an advantage. It's only the aperture that counts. There's actually a lot more at play. But yeah, I thought it was interesting to look back at the basics, just at what a telescope does. Field of view to image circle. That's all it does. And it does that by being awesome. And it does that by, playing with the focal length, playing with the aperture. And when we look just at those parameters, we can look at the telescope independently of anything else, of a camera, of anything, and really understand some things, maybe more intuitively or less. Let me know if I've confused you more than otherwise. So please let me know your thoughts down in the comments about this kind of like, to me at least, kind of new way of thinking of what a telescope does, whether it helped you or not, or whether you think I'm completely off the rails and you want me to do something different and you want me to delete my video and whatever. So let me know down in the comments. While you're at it, you can like or dislike the video, you can subscribe if you like this kind of video, and if you want to support the channel, because this is a lot of work. As always, the first time that I attempt animations in my editing software, it took a lot of time for those really bad animations, but I tried. But if you want to support me even more and you're planning on buying anything from Agena, High Point Scientific, First Light Optics, etc., if you do so after clicking one of the links that I have down in the description, it will help me out at no cost to you. If you want to sponsor the channel directly and become really a VIP supporter of the channel, you can become a Patreon supporter. The link is down in the description. Our channel member, it's the join button next to the subscribe button. And you guys, you know it. You make this entire channel, this entire adventure possible. Thank you so much for your support. It's thanks to you that I'm able to keep making videos. With that, more important than anything else, I hope this was useful and interesting. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget, whenever you can, to look up at the stars in a specific field of view with a specific radius in arc degrees that gets translated on your retina in an image circle. It does, it really does with your eyes. Sorry, I'm getting off the rails again. But yeah, with that, I'll see you next time.